Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. We have a very big trip coming up in the person of the President of the United States, sometime, I believe, early in July at this point. He envisions going to the Middle East and working a variety of different diplomatic agendas. And we spoke earlier in the week with Ambassador Yoram Ettinger of Israel about this trip. And I must say, it makes me very anxious that any good can conceivably come of what the president is up to and what he and his staff would have in mind for his interactions with the Israelis on the one hand, the Palestinians, and others of our friends, such as they are in the Persian Gulf, notably the Saudi government and its partners in the Gulf Coordination Council. To discuss all of this, I'm pleased to have with us a colleague of mine at the Center for Security Policy, our Director of Middle East Programs. His name is Dr. David Wurmser. He has served in a number of capacities in the United States government, both as a uniformed naval intelligence officer and as a special assistant to the Vice President, to the National Security Advisor, to the Undersecretary of State, having a lot of experience, particularly in Middle Eastern affairs. We're always delighted to have a chance to pick his brain about what we are confronting at a moment such as this, not least in terms of the U.S. government's approach to Iran. And so we're pleased to be able to converse with David Wurmser about all of this. Welcome back, David. Good to have you with us, sir.
Well, thank you, Frank, and it's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you. If not the subjects, but at least the conversation.
Yes, well, we enjoy the conversation, but it's not always pleasant, that's for sure. Let's start, David, with Israel, if we can. The government of Joe Biden has done, it seems to me, immense harm to our relationship with Israel at a time when it is more important than ever, it seems to me, that we have a strong relationship with the Jewish state, that it be secure, and an awful lot of things seem to be increasingly imperiling Israel's security, and partly thanks, it seems, to the policies of this government. What do you expect President Biden to do and say to his Israeli hosts in the course of this upcoming trip?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's time for the Israelis to don their diplomatic flak jackets, and essentially they need a diplomatic Iron Dome right now from the United States visit. And what's happening is that the United States is operating under the assumption, an erroneous assumption, that it needs desperately to bring the Palestinians in on a peace process to stabilize the situation, to stabilize Jordan, and therefore finally move the peace process forward, because they see the Abraham Accords as fake. They see it as not real peace because the Palestinians weren't involved. They were offered to be involved. They refused. But at any rate, they feel this is a fake peace and that it will only all work if the Israelis finally yield to a Palestinian state and grant the PLO its leadership of it in its entirety of the West Bank. And the result would be that then the United States can happily work with the other Arabs to deal with other things. At the same time that we're moving with Iran in a non-robust way. So essentially what the United States, under those assumptions, are doing, they're coming there to force the Israelis to open up a Palestinian consulate and give a deliverable to the Palestinians, give a deliverable to King Abdullah of Jordan on Jerusalem, and moreover, in their view, give a deliverable to the Saudis and the UAE on the Palestinian issue as a whole. All of which are very questionable assumptions. The last one, the Saudis and the UAE, they don't want the Israelis to deliver on the Palestinians at this point.
Yes. It seems wrong on so many different levels, David, what you've just laid out, of course. Um, the the thing that was, I believe, one of the most remarkable accomplishments of the Trump administration was it established that you could, in fact, have peace with Israel and its neighbors without the Palestinians being involved when they chose to take themselves out of the mix. And those pieces, as I think we've seen of late, are indeed continuing to be built upon. Are they not, in terms of trade relations, among other things, strategic partnerships as well, in the face of the shared threat that these nations, including
It's
Israel,
accelerating.
feel from Iran?
It's accelerating. The Israeli relationships with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia, although it's not in a formal state of peace, are very robust at this point and
Mm.
accelerating on all levels, like you mentioned. And it's largely because of the perception of Israeli strength and solidity in the absence of American power for a
There you
useful
go.
purpose.
Right.
Uh, so they realize Israel is their best bet at the strong horse in the region. And they want Israel to stand strong, and they want Israel to confront the Iranians and also the Turks.
Hmm.
And whereas the United States is in a completely different page.
It
What we
is.
see with the United States is a constant undertone of trying to find new mechanisms to convince the Israelis not to act either on Hezbollah in Lebanon or on Iran,
Mm.
and then to leverage the dependence that ensues from that to force an Israeli concessions on the Palestinian issue. That's
Yeah.
exactly the opposite of what the UAE and Saudis want.
And David, the experience with the Palestinians has not borne the kind of uh, confidence that would make this radical departure from the Trump approach warranted at this point. The Palestinians, if anything, seem to be incessantly seeking to instigate a new set of hostilities with the Israelis, whether it's Hamas on the one hand or whether it's Fatah and a kind of new intifada on the Temple Mount and elsewhere. It seems as though the administration is unmoored from reality in this regard. And I just wonder if the president goes into this meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, for example, and uh, persists in trying to open up a consulate at odds with this whole effort to create an embassy, a recognition of Israel's full and unified control of Jerusalem, and sort of inflames this situation at the to the fury, I imagine, of the Israeli government. It's hard to see this is actually going to advance peace in
No,
any sense of the word.
no, it'll move it way back. We have to also look at the historical record, really going all the way back to World War One. The British and then the United States have always labored under this assumption, the foreign policy elites, that somehow proximity or being seen as the ally of the Jews or the Zionists or the Israelis has to be balanced against our alliance and friendship with the Arab world, and that therefore we have to keep distance. But the historical record shows the more that we place distance, or the British and then us place distance between ourselves and the Israelis, the worse our relations became with the more moderate Arab world, because
Yes.
they saw us as abandoning our key ally in the region, and they knew what that meant for them. So they
Mm-hmm.
couldn't have faith in America, despite all the rhetoric and everything. It was a perception of whether the United States has both the strength and the will to be a superpower in the region. So,
Hold that thought, David. That's really an important point that I want to pick up on the other side of a very short break. We're going to continue our conversation with Dr. David Wurmser of the Center for Security Policy, specifically with respect to how this translates into that wider regional challenge of Iran and our interests there. Stay tuned.